Welcome back to the London Futurists podcast. The Partnership on AI was launched back in September 2016 during an earlier flurry of interest in AI as a forum for the tech giants to meet leaders from academia, the media, and what used to be called pressure groups and are now called civil society. By 2019, more than 100 of these organizations had joined. The founding tech giants were Amazon, Facebook, Google, DeepMind, Microsoft, and IBM. Apple joined a year later, and Baidu joined in 2018. Our guest today is Rebecca Finlay, who joined the PAI board in early 2020 and was appointed CEO in October 2021. Rebecca is a Canadian who started her career in banking and then led marketing and policy development groups in a number of Canadian healthcare and scientific research organizations. In the run-up to the Bletchley Park Global Summit on AI, the Partnership on AI has launched a set of guidelines to help the companies that are developing advanced AI systems, making them available to you and me. Rebecca will be addressing the delegates at Bletchley and no doubt hoping that the summit will establish the PAI guidelines as the basis for global self-regulation of the AI industry. Rebecca, thank you very much for joining the London Futurist podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
It's a pleasure to meet you, Rebecca.
Let's start with the reason why PAI has developed the guidelines. How would you describe the major risks they're intended to address?
So I think one of the interesting things about the conversation around risk right now is that we've seen two poles emerging, those that are focusing very much on current societal risk. This is very much the work that PAI, but many other organizations, both in the private sector and in nonprofit and in government too, have been attending to with regard to what we now call artificial intelligence, these deep learning, machine learning systems and models. And what we're now understanding could be some emerging capabilities or risks in some of these very, very large models, which have really taken prominence over the last year and certainly has captured the public's attention through ChatGPT. What we do at PAI is try to bring together very different perspectives and voices to understand risk quite broadly. In fact, we define safety really through the lens of safety for society. That starts with what we know today about current risk and extends through to what we're starting to learn, maybe some future risks with regard to these models, really with the goal of saying, let's take what we've learned, let's understand the fundamentals of how these systems are operating and the emerging capabilities, and by better understanding that, better understand the potential risks.
I'm really glad that you bring up this two-pole schism, which has opened up, unfortunately, in the perception of risks from AI, the bifurcation between short-term risks, which some people called AI ethics, and David and I prefer to call responsible AI, things like bias, transparency, the potential for mass personalized hacking, that sort of thing, on the one hand. And on the other hand, the longer-term risks of ultimately superintelligence, and before that, the possibility of widespread lasting technological unemployment. And I detect from what you say that PAI is focused more on the short-term risks and less on the long-term risk. Is that fair?
I would say that what we're trying to do is to build a bridge from what we know about the short-term risk to potential better understanding about future risk. And in fact, one of the needs that we felt was important for an organization like PAI to fill because of the diversity of perspectives that we have around the table is to try to create ways to better understand risk. We tend to talk about what risks are, but we don't necessarily talk about how do we understand risk and what risks require more protections or more actions and what the potential impacts are. So part of what we did in our guidance was really try to understand and frame out a taxonomy of risk that looks at what we know about current and extends into future. And so that's provided as one of the pieces of guidances. The other piece about risk, of course, that's part of the current conversation is how much of that risk comes from the model and the model providers, and that's where we've centered our guidances, versus the applications themselves. And so we've also tried to help both providers and policymakers better understand sort of the spectrum of where those risks might fall. And so you could have something like concerns about misinformation or disinformation. And you could have concerns that are clearly in current models with regard to both the capability of those models to provide inaccurate information or for inaccurate information to be shared, and also for malicious actors to actually intentionally provide disinformation into the system. So boy, we know a lot about that in terms of some of the current platforms and the way in which they have been deployed and misused. And I think what we're seeing in some of these generative AI models is the capacity to do that at a much higher level of quality and a potentially much higher level of scale.
Mm-hmm.
So there's an example of a risk that I think we have characterized fairly clearly in the current environment, and that characterization has led to things like the synthetic media framework that we released earlier this year, and I'd be more than happy to talk about. And that helps us to better understand how that could emerge in future models as well.
I really like the diagram that's in the document you've released and it's on your website. It doesn't show two poles. It shows a two-dimensional array. There's known risks at the top and speculative risks below, and there's a spectrum in between. And on the other dimension, there's application risks versus model risks. And then there's a color coding as well between malicious uses. That's when people intentionally misuse it, perhaps to hack or impersonate or sabotage an election. There's other aspects of societal risks, such as people working on this AI who have to do this human feedback and reinforcement learning, which is quite a nasty task. And there's, you've called it, other risks as well. I want to congratulate you on this taxonomy. I note that Rishi Sunak, the UK Prime Minister, highlighted this morning in a speech he gave to the Royal Society that his first goal for the Bletchley Park Summit was, similarly, an agreement on risk. Because he says when we're disagreeing about what's risky and what's not risky, we can't really make much progress. I guess there's an alignment there.
I think I would applaud the desire to better understand risk. I think one of the areas that is going to require significant research moving forward is around some of those, what we refer to as speculative risks, others would refer to as anticipated risks, this question of the longer term risks of these models. And again, even longer term, I'm not sure is a correct way to characterize these types of risks, but potentially we could say future risks of larger capability models. And to really try to understand what is missing in our understanding of the capabilities of these models that could then drive the types of risks moving forward. I think that one thing that is extremely useful about the way in which the summit to date has been framed is to keep it quite focused around frontier models with a specific focus on risk related to, as I understand it, misuse and loss of control. There have not been international conversations of this size or of this profile to focus on that particular area. I think that that's one of the useful things because, as we all know, you can only accomplish so much in 2 days, but also you have to find where those potential opportunities are to add something new to the conversation. And so I'm very happy that there's been a choice with regard to how to focus and frame the summit. And I'm also hoping that out of that, we'll see all sorts of benefits across the community in terms of better understanding how that fits into a broader understanding of risk moving forward.
You make a very good point about timing. I've traditionally talked about the short-term risks being privacy bias and so on, and the longer-term risks being superintelligence, etc. And we had Connor Leahy on the podcast previously, and he objected to that, saying that it's actually not very far until we get to AGI. Now, he has a very accelerated timeline. He thinks that it could arrive in 2 years. But then again, Sam Altman thinks it's probably going to arrive before the end of the decade, so it may not be all that long term. But I think it is great that the summit is at least billed as encompassing what you call speculative risk. I think that's a pretty good word for it, traditionally called long-term risk. Because, as you said, there hasn't been a forum for leaders, global leaders, to discuss this before. And it's important that there is one. In your guidelines, I didn't see any requirement for the companies deploying frontier models to explain the data that they've been trained on. I imagine you've probably had some people saying you're not calling for full transparency in the model development. How would you respond to that?
I think that in terms of the work that was done by the collective group that came together to work on this, they addressed that quite clearly in the transparency requirement on pre-system documentation. And within the specifications around what's a normative baseline best practice with regard to pre-system, so pre-released transparency, there's a number of different ingredients that they spell out. And one of them is about data sets. I think we just say that they need to be transparent about the data, the training data on which the system is developed and deployed. From my perspective, I feel that's a really crucial question.
So would your guidelines require, for instance, OpenAI to say what data GPT-4 was trained on, which they absolutely have refused to do so far?
As it stands right now, we have asked for them to develop a best practice around what transparency looks like with regard to the data set. And I would encourage, just as these guidelines do, for those to set a baseline on which we could be seeing much more transparency across the board. And I think that this is crucial. As you'll see in the guidance, there's many recommendations with regard to the importance of third-party oversight. And we could talk a little bit about the complexities of trying to create those systems and how do you do that responsibly. But without that, I think we will not be able to fully understand one component of the risk in the system, which is what are the core ingredients that are going into developing that system before it's deployed. Of course, once it's deployed, whole sets of other sort of monitoring recommendations as well. But crucially important that we have that transparency.
I'm seeing on the website now, point 16 of the 22 that you offer for consideration is indeed that you recommend support for third-party inspection of models and training data so that third parties should be able to conduct audits for responsible training of the system. That makes good sense. And I think the Prime Minister of the UK would agree. He was complaining in a way, in his very positive way he speaks, about the AI companies marking their own homework at the moment. They have their own testing teams, their own quality assurance teams, which I'm sure are full of capable people. But it's one thing to mark your own homework, and it's another thing, especially when you're in a rush and you're trying to get to the market as quickly as possible, it's another thing to have third parties do it. So how are you going to persuade these companies to actually conform to the fine principles you've set out? It's one thing to say, yeah, this makes sense. It's another thing to actually know whether companies are going to line up and do it.
Well, I think there's a whole variety of incentives that go into promoting best practice from a company's perspective as well. One of the contributions that we believe we make is that setting out normative standards against which behavior can be compared is a crucial first step. And often can happen, although it takes time and it takes a real effort for the community to come together. And crucially important with industry at the table to try to better understand what the limitations and opportunities might be. But setting a normative best practice is able to sometimes move more quickly than regulation. And I think that's one of the contributions that we make in terms of driving incentives into the broader ecosystem that will advance some of this responsible action and practice. But I don't think that that's a long-term solution. That is only, in my mind, one way to get started, and that we do have to look at all sorts of other policy levers. It could include regulation. It could include all sorts of other ways in which a government can act to require and support different forms of transparency.
Can we dig in a bit more on that? I like the vision that politics is more than regulation. It should be about incentives as well, setting a vision. You said there are policy levers, so can you give us some examples of what these non-regulatory levers might be?
There's many. One of the ones that we often see is that government will use their role as large procurers of systems and technologies to ensure that their procurement systems have within them responsibility codes and requirements. And being such large purchasers within a national jurisdiction, they can really influence the behavior across the private sector. So that's one which I think is always important. We certainly are seeing this being deployed in some of the different communications that we've heard in Washington, D.C., with regard to how they want to both stand up responsibility within the use of technologies inside government, but also in terms of procuring or securing services outside of government. I think influence is an important one. When President Biden called the CEOs of the large technology companies to the White House and had a frank discussion about responsibility and innovation, that's another example of a way in which governments can act. Very similar to that is the holding of a summit. It only contributes so much, but it is influential in centering the attention, both of the private sector and also of the public, and clearly in this case of the broader international community as well, on topics. And then, of course, there are legislative means and processes, and so you can see something like GDPR and its influence in the EU, and how its influence has really extended beyond the EU into other markets as well. And so watching closely what's going to happen with the EU AI Act, for example, I think will be interesting moving forward. I'm sure you both could speak about many levers as well that government has. I certainly think there are many ways in which government can ensure incentives are in place.
And sorry to harp on about this transparency thing, but have OpenAI and Google DeepMind indicated that they might open up and divulge what data their models were trained on? They both got very poor marks from a Stanford group recently, which calibrated the level of openness and transparency. It would be a big step for them to divulge what the data was, because they have resisted it so far.
Yes. Not that I'm aware of, and I would encourage them, yes, to do so.
Yeah. As you talk, I can tell your immense diplomatic capabilities. You've got a long list of very varied members in your organization, and it must have been like herding cats to get agreement on these guidelines. Were there some very robust arguments as it went through, or was it all plain sailing?
Oh, no. That's one of the joys of leading a multi-stakeholder organization, listening to very different perspectives and expertise coming together. I think of these systems as being socio-technical systems, and so the need to really have interdisciplinary perspectives around the table, not least of which includes different sectoral perspectives and different national perspectives as well in terms of this work. We work very hard to create space across those different perspectives, to respect where voices are coming from, to share and understand methodologies and terminologies and languages so that there's a real opportunity for constructive conversation to take place. I will say there is a strong consensus across the community of individuals and organizations that PAI brings together that responsibility in innovation is a must-have, and that there are limitations within companies to better understand what normative best practice looks like, and resource choices about how to support those best practices, and a strong desire amongst civil society to ensure that the perspectives with regard to impacts and impacts on different communities are heard. We always are looking for that space where our particular model can add value. And in some ways, these guidances create, I think, a normative framework. Each one of them needs more action. Each one of them needs more research. And there are many different actors in the ecosystem that we would like to see pick up this work and take it forward. In fact, that's what we're really hoping, is that it will catalyze a whole series of different activities to really move it forward. Not just one single effort that's going to make the change we want to see.
We'll be right back after a quick break.
The People in Performance podcast offers insights into the strategic competencies, behaviors, and results needed to increase the performance of employees and leaders. The show looks at all areas of the world of work, including attraction and recruitment, onboarding, training, and succession planning. Tune in to get a better handle on the stages of workforce planning you need to master in order to guarantee long-term success in a rapidly changing world of work. New episodes drop each week. Check out the latest People in Performance episodes on your podcast platform of choice. Follow us on socials and read the latest articles at pppod.com.
Talking about getting wider support, having a bigger impact, I noticed you've had a very impressive 2-day meeting in London, invitation only. My invitation seems to have got lost in the post somewhere, but never mind. Could you give us some indication as to what was the mood there? What was the key topics that you can share? And is the movement forward as you are hoping for?
We've had a couple of great days. I don't know what happened to your invitation. I'll have to take a look and see if I can find that for you. I apologize. Fascinating discussion. Certainly, it was important to us that we center ourselves in the UK conversation because of this moment. And I think there was strong interest from our community, both those that came from outside of the UK, but also within the UK. And we have a number of partners who are based in the UK, all the way from the Alan Turing and DeepMind to many others. Important, I think, to center ourselves and the conversation here because of the debate that is being centered here right now. And also for us, really kicked off the public comment period for this guidance work. So yet another level of multi-stakeholder engagement that we intend to do is to really now open up this guidance for additional input from the public. You're probably getting the sense from me that we really do see this as a living document. It's not ever probably going to be finalized and finished. So the question is, how do we iterate it and adapt it as we learn more going forward? So public consultation, that was the first day. It was great to see the guidance come out and to start to hear some of the feedback from the broader community and to think about where maybe some topics we really want to dive into through the public consultation process, like open source and other areas that are emerging for a lot of interest. So that's been great. And then, of course, one of the themes we heard loud and clear is we're not starting from scratch. Whether it's policymakers, and we had individuals who were speaking from all sorts of different jurisdictions, there's a lot of work that's been done centered squarely on artificial intelligence, but also, as we know, in a whole bunch of other regulatory domains, whether it's standard setting in terms of interoperability across different jurisdictions, whether it's cybersecurity, or coming from different initiatives around strengthening democratic institutions and citizen engagement. So that's certainly what I heard. We're not starting from scratch. There's a lot of good work that is underway that we can build upon. And no surprise, exactly that point I made previously. How do we build a really fruitful, healthy ecosystem of initiatives that are really tackling this work and are additive to each other? So that we're not replicating each other's work, but trying to find out how do we advance the right research that we need to do to really figure out how we best deploy these systems for the benefit of people in society. So yeah, great couple of days. Looking forward to having some time to think more deeply about it and see where we go next. This is the first time we've done this. We've really just started up our work about thinking about how we translate insights out of our work, really mostly focused on practice into policy. So lots of opportunity to think about where we go next.
One of your members, the Future of Life Institute, famously called for a 6-month moratorium on the development of advanced AI systems. And I can well imagine that your founder members would not be interested in pursuing that idea. Presumably that was discussed during the development of the guidelines. Can you envisage a moment in the future when you personally or the organization as a whole would think that was the appropriate thing to do?
You know, that's an interesting question. What I really liked about the Future of Life letter was the way in which it drew attention to this moment. In some ways, the first time that's done, I think sometimes creates attention. We've seen letters since that maybe didn't receive the same level of attention. And then I also think that it's just very hard. We talked about incentives previously, to align incentives around a call of that nature. For me, I really need to understand how some of these capabilities are emerging, to understand just whether or not we would be in a position where that would happen. And I guess my hope would be we won't be in that position. That's why we're all doing the work we're doing, to ensure that we're actively thinking about how you develop responsible practices at scale and at pace with innovation moving forward. So yes, I remain an optimist.
Right. That's a good position to take. I guess if you get to a point where the systems are so good, I mean, GPT-4 is seriously impressive, but if you get to the point where it really is clear that we're not far off AGI and therefore not far off superintelligence, and we haven't got to the point where we are completely confident that we can control an entity much cleverer than us, that's the point at which the discussion would get very heated about, do we stop or do we carry on and just take the risk? And obviously, there's the argument that if the good actors in the world, and I personally do include OpenAI and Google DeepMind in that category, they stop, other bad actors wouldn't stop. So there's that argument. But the good actors perhaps ought to say, well, even if the bad actors are going to carry on, we shouldn't bring this risky thing into the world. And that's the point at which the discussion will get very pointy indeed.
I find it very difficult to speculate. And I find that the challenge for me is this notion of the definition of artificial general intelligence and what that actually means and looks like. I guess I'm not only an optimist, I guess I'm a bit of a pragmatist as well. I mean, I love great films and science fiction like everybody else. Actually, that's one of the things I enjoy the most about AI, is this capacity for sort of wonder and possibility. And then I think, how do I really understand how that would operate? And what would be the constraints that we would already have built into these models that could assist us? So when we get there, and I guess that's another question too, will we know when we do get there? I think those are all worthy questions.
That's why personally I'm trying to deprioritize the term AGI, artificial general intelligence. Look for other, more pragmatic definitions.
Yes.
It's an AI that could help us solve cancer. We all want that. An AI that could cause a catastrophic risk, could enable bad actors to kill not just a nightclub full of people, but cities or countries full of people. We don't want that. So I'd focus on the capabilities. What I see people talking about now isn't we should pause. Well, some people want to pause, but we should decide in advance some red lines. And if we see that models are going beyond certain red lines, also called canary signals, then we should already have contingency measures prepared. Nobody likes contingency measures. It's like locking down the economy if there's a pandemic. Nobody likes doing that, but you have to plan in advance just in case that happens. I guess that's one possible future for the pause, and I'm expecting there will be discussions about that at Bletchley. So let me ask you, what are you hoping to get out of the time you spend in Bletchley? Do you have a sneak preview you can share with us about what you're going to be asking for?
I am very much looking forward to having this remarkable community come together at this moment to have this conversation. What often happens in these environments is that you do come away with a greater depth of knowledge and a greater shared understanding, first of all, from where people are coming from, but also where they may be going next. I think summits create a real focal point for those types of conversations to take place and for national governments to make announcements about the investments and actions that they're going to be taking forward. And I always think there's an opportunity for governments to learn from each other and be competitive in their own way, whether it's responsibility or economic development or otherwise. It'll be really interesting to see what this will catalyze in that regard. Communiques that come out of summits like this can really often just set the baseline with regard to where we go next. And then one of the last things I'm hoping to see out of the summit is, there are a number of international activities underway right now. At the G7, we have what's called the Hiroshima process, which is looking at voluntary principles with regard to responsible development of, I think they're calling it advanced AI, maybe generative AI systems. There's supposed to be a code of conduct that's going to emerge. We have work that's just emerging at the UN with regard to a new advisory group that's being pulled together by the Tech Envoy. In my opportunity to participate in some of these conversations at different points, I'm seeing a real intent to try to harmonize in some ways across each of these sets of voluntary standards, all the way from the White House commitments to the G7. And I think that's also very healthy as well. if we're creating an international environment whereby we're starting to lay out some of what good looks like, then I think we're really starting to set the conditions for both private sector action, but also for national government action as well.
Well, Rebecca, we should be respectful of your time. You're at the center of a very interesting hurricane. It's terrific that these conversations are happening. Let's hope that the summit and the other initiatives that you've talked about have a positive outcome and we can solve some of the very interesting, large, knotty problems that they all raise. Thank you very much indeed for joining the London Futurists podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.